Three bikers cornered a lone female mechanic outside a dusty bar, laughing as they knocked over her tools and called her Oil Princess. They thought she was just another woman with grease on her hands. What they didn't know, what no one warned them, is that she once trained the most elite soldiers in the world. No threats, no raised voice, just silence, precision, and a memory forged at Fort Bragg. By the time the first one hit the ground, the bar had gone completely still. This isn't the story they'll tell at the bar, but it's the one that actually happened, and you're about to hear it. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The smoke started thin, almost blue in the morning sun, and lifted from beneath the hood like breath held too long. The air smelled of antifreeze and rust. Route 11 wasn't much more than a stretch of tired asphalt hugging a line of pine trees, but traffic rolled through just enough to keep the bar's neon sign flickering and the garage beside it alive. The kind of place where engines coughed more than they purred, where everyone smelled faintly of rubber and dust. Wren stood with her left boot braced against the tire rim, her upper body bent into the engine bay of an old Ford F-150. Her overalls were faded, knees stained, sleeves rolled just past the elbows. The skin of her forearms was tanned from years of outdoor work, marked with faint scars that didn't beg questions. A wrench rested in her palm like it had been molded there. Every motion was slow and deliberate, no wasted movement. No second-guessing dot. The roadside bar across the gravel lot was just opening. The half-tank blinked in red against wood siding that had warped over time. Its porch sagged a little. On one side, an alone rocking chair sat empty, worn smooth by patrons who drank too long and remembered too little. It wasn't much, but it was the closest thing to a center of gravity for 20 miles in either direction. The hiss of steam from the engine didn't startle Wren. She reached to the side, blindly feeling for the rag she'd tossed on the fender, wiped her hands, checked a connection, and leaned deeper. From the edge of the lot came the sound low, distant at first, like thunder warming up, then closer, tires grinding gravel. 3 motorcycles pulled in, one after the other, and stopped. Just past the fuel pumps that hadn't worked in a decade, chrome caught the sun. Loud pipes. Custom paint, the kind of bikes that carried more attitude than distance. She didn't look up right away. The first to swing a leg off his bike was tall, wiry, with a beard that made up for the hair he lacked. He wore leather, even though the heat would have made a sane man sweat, and dark glasses that didn't hide how directly he stared. His companions followed, one with thick arms and sleeves of faded ink, the other younger. With a grin that hadn't yet learned its limits, they didn't say anything. At first, just stood there, side by side, taking in the bar, the empty stretch of highway, and finally, her. The taller one tilted his head, then started toward her, boots crunching on gravel, with that slow, practiced kind of swagger. Didn't announce himself. Just watched as she pulled the dipstick, checked the oil, and reached for another tool. Her posture didn't shift. She didn't offer a nod, a smile, or even a glance. That seemed to bother him more than anything, he said finally, stopping a few feet away. Wren said nothing. The hood propped above her cast a long shadow that cut across her face, making her unreadable. She placed the wrench down on the fender, wiped her fingers again, and leaned in to inspect the radiator. Just trying to be friendly, he added, louder this time. Behind him, the younger one chuckled, already pulling off his gloves, tossing them onto his seat. The third leaned against a pump, arms crossed, watching like he'd seen scenes like this unfold before and liked the way they usually ended. Wren finally stepped back. She stood straight, tall despite her small frame, and turned to face them. There was no trace of a smile, no welcome in her eyes, just a kind of stillness, the sort that often gets mistaken for patience until it breaks. I don't need help, she said simply. The tall one's grin widened. Well, that's good, 'cause we weren't really offering. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was deliberate, the kind that let wind pass through it and made gravel shift beneath boots. From the porch of the bar, the bartender stepped out with a cigarette barely lit. He saw them, paused, then went back inside. He didn't want to be part of whatever was about to happen. Few ever did when men like that decided they were bored. But Wren didn't move, didn't blink. She turned back to the truck, reached for her tools, and got to work again. Smoke rose, heat shimmered, and behind her, the bikers. Didn't know it yet, but they were standing in a place where they weren't in control. The back room of the garage smelled of oil, metal, and something older ash from the small stove that hadn't been lit in years, but still carried the scent of long winters. Light filtered in through a narrow, dust-streaked window, catching in the air like it had settled there decades ago and never left. Along the far wall, a pegboard displayed every tool with meticulous order. Wren didn't label them. She didn't need to. Each piece had its place sockets lined from smallest to largest, pliers spaced with the kind of precision usually seen in armories. Some of the handles were worn smooth, grips darkened by years of use. Others were wrapped in cloth, not because they were broken, but because Wren's hands preferred texture over slick rubber. The room was quiet, just the occasional tick of metal cooling. The radio on the shelf hadn't worked since early spring. No music, no static, just silence. She liked it that way. Out front, the garage rolled on with its rhythm clients needing brakes, fans replaced, batteries checked. But in the back, this was her place. It didn't pretend. No clocks, no photos, no distractions, just tools, parts, and the hum of thought. Wren moved through the room like someone who'd measured every step before. Not graceful, not light, just efficient. She lifted a carburetor off the workbench, examined it against the slanting light, then placed it down gently on a cloth pad. Her hands, though calloused, worked like they'd been trained in something more than repair. The kind of motion that came from habit, drilled in, not learned casually. Every twist of the wrist, every measured turn of a bolt-it spoke of muscle memory shaped by something older than this garage. At 39, she had a quiet strength that didn't announce itself. No one knew where she'd come from. Some said Texas. Others guessed North Carolina. She never confirmed. Didn't say much, unless it was about torque specs or whether the distributor cap was original. Her voice was low even. No drawl, no sharp edges, just calm. If you asked what she did before the garage, she'd tell you she worked with her hands. If you asked again, she wouldn't answer. There was an old cot in the corner, folded neat, a wool blanket on top, not because she stayed overnight, but because she could. In winter, when the storms came and the power flickered, she didn't mind sleeping next to the steel shelves and motor oil. The stove hadn't been used in years, but she kept it clean. Ashes swept out, chimney cleared. She didn't like unfinished things. On a narrow shelf above the workbench sat a few personal items: a leather-bound notebook, a tarnished dog tag, looped around a bolt, and a single photo face down. It had been that way for years. No one had ever dared flip it over. People came and went through the front of the shop, mostly regulars who respected her space and knew better than to linger. They said she had magic in her fingers, that she could coax engines into running long after they should have been junked. She never took more than she needed, always priced fair. Didn't upsell, didn't ask questions when someone came in looking shaken, or when a woman from up the canyon brought her car in with a dent that didn't match her story. She just fixed what needed fixing and let the rest be. Some noticed the way she stood, straight back, feet just slightly apart. A stance that looked practiced, her movements slow, deliberate, like someone who didn't waste energy on bluff or panic. You could watch her clean a carburetor and know she could also strip something far more dangerous. If it came to that, the tools hanging on the wall weren't just for work. They were arranged with the same care someone else might give to firearms. She never said why. But when you watched her pick one up, just the ease, the readiness, you got the sense she wasn't the kind of person you'd want to surprise. In the bar across the lot, stories spread. They called her Wren the Wrench. Said she once ex-military. Said she once lifted a Harley off a trapped rider without breaking a sweat. Most of it was exaggerated. Some of it wasn't. But Wren didn't correct them. She just kept fixing engines and waiting for whatever might come down the road next. Tuesday started like most others. The sky was a dull gray, still unsure whether to clear or rain, and the wind carried a chill that clung to the skin without asking permission. Wren unlocked the garage at 6:45, same as always. She didn't check the forecast. The weather would do what it pleased, and she'd work through it just the same. By 7:15, the first customer had pulled in. An old Ford Taurus she knew by sound before it even turned the corner. Mrs. Langley, seat barely high enough to see over the steering wheel, engine rattling like change in a tin can. Wren waved her in, raised the hood, and listened. The timing. Belt was slipping. She told Mrs. Langley it'd hold a little longer, but not much. The woman nodded like always, eyes watery behind thick glasses, and left her usual bag of die-old muffins on the bench as thanks. Wren didn't stop her. Most customers didn't talk much once they realized Wren wouldn't fill the silence. She was polite but brief, no idle questions. No "how's the family" unless you brought it up first. That didn't make her cold, it made her safe. The kind of safe that didn't pry. People came for oil changes and left lighter than they arrived, like the silence she offered had cleared something more than their carburetor. A few brought gossip, hoping to draw her into it. She let them talk, but never gave anything back. If they asked why she never married, or why she never left, she just handed them their keys and walked back inside. There were rumors, of course. Some said she'd been a military mechanic. Others whispered about training men for combat, surviving ambushes, desert deployments. A few even claimed she'd once been part of something classified, the kind of black ops stuff people only half believe when they've had a few too many. But Wren never confirmed any of it. She just fixed what was broken and handed people back their lives in the form of steady engines and quiet reassurance. It was nearly noon when the different sound pulled in, not a sputtering sedan or the hum of a local's pickup. This was something else, low, throaty, and too smooth to be from around here. Wren didn't look up at first. She was elbow-deep in a Subaru's engine block, hands steady as she tightened a bracket that had started to warp from heat. But she listened. The sound split into three as more bikes rolled in behind the first. Not the town's usual riders. Guys knew better than to disrupt the peace she kept around the shop. These weren't familiar. She could tell by the timing of their throttle pulls, the volume of their exhausts, show-offs loud on purpose. The kind of riders who didn't tune for performance, they tuned for intimidation. The bikes had settled into a triangle just outside the shop's gravel entrance, chrome polished. Engines still ticking from heat, handlebars wide like the men who rode them, wanted to take up more space than they needed. One of them caught her eye. Not because of his build or the black vest stretched across his chest, but because of the way he looked at her. Not curious, not cautious, just presumptive, like he'd already made up his mind about who she was. Wren didn't flinch. She never did. She stood there, towel in hand, letting the quiet hang in the air between them. The first one dismounted, boots hitting gravel with too much emphasis. He looked around slowly, taking in the pump, the bar, the lot. The open hood of the car she'd been working on didn't expect to see a lady running the place, he said, voice just loud enough to carry across the yard. Wren said nothing. Just walked past him to close the Subaru's hood, her eyes on the latch. Not on him. The other two laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that said they weren't joking. Not really. Inside the bar, a curtain shifted. Someone peeked out, saw what was happening, and let the curtain fall back into place. Wren wiped her hands again, slower this time. The bikes were polished, the men weren't locals, and the day was about to turn into something she hadn't seen in years. She could feel it in her shoulders. Something in their walk said they thought they understood the situation. They didn't. The first one came in too fast. His tires sprayed a loose scatter of gravel across the lot. A deliberate move, the kind meant to catch attention. The second followed close behind, engine revving just enough to echo off the rusted signage hanging above the bar's front door. The third was slower, more measured, but no less loud. Together, the three bikes formed a line along the edge of the lot, like sentries posted at a perimeter only they understood. From where she stood, under the narrow strip of shade thrown by the open garage door, Wren wiped her hands on a rag that had seen too many brake jobs. Her eyes narrowed just enough to track their movements without giving anything away. She leaned against the frame, one boot crossed over the other, and let the sun catch in her hair where it wasn't tucked up under her cap. To anyone watching, she might have looked indifferent, but inside, she was already assessing. The bikes were customized chrome, flared and gleaming. Paint too fresh for locals, pipes loud for no mechanical reason. She could see patches sewn onto vests, but not the kind from this county. Their engines still ticked from the ride, metal cooling in the open air. But the noise wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. Loud on arrival, loud in posture, loud in presence. The first rider dismounted with a swagger that betrayed a need to be seen. His hair was slicked back beneath a bandana, beard trimmed too neatly to be accidental, rings on both hands, heavy boots. He scanned the lot like he was looking for someone to challenge him not with words, but with weight. The second man was broader, arms thick with layered tattoos that blurred together from distance. He moved like someone used to being backup, not leadership. The third stayed on his bike for a few seconds longer, watching them both. His eyes were hidden behind dark lenses, but Wren noticed his shoulders didn't fully relax. He hadn't ridden in just for the posturing. He was watching for something. They hadn't spoken yet, but their energy was already louder than their engines. Wren folded the rag, placed it on the hood of the Corolla she'd been working on, and waited. The heat off the lot shimmered faintly, the kind of summer warmth that settled in bone deep if you stood still long enough. Her shadow stretched toward the edge of the open bay. She didn't move forward. Let them come, the first one saw her. He tilted his head as if surprised, then smirked. Not because he recognized her, he didn't. It was the smirk of a man who saw a woman in coveralls and assumed things. Wrong things. Didn't know the mechanic was going to be this easy on the eyes, he said, loud enough for his boys to hear. She didn't answer, just watched, eyes steady under the brim of her cap. The rag she'd used was still tucked in her belt. The second man laughed under his breath. The third said nothing. Wren didn't blink. The tension in the lot changed, not dramatically, just enough that someone watching closely might have felt it. The wind kicked up a little dust. A door inside the bar creaked shut. The sound of a screen door slamming came from somewhere out back. None of it mattered. She'd seen men like this before. Different states, different years, same hunger to provoke, same need to measure themselves against someone who wouldn't give them what they were used to. The first man took a few steps closer. He didn't cross any line, just stepped near it. The second followed. "You run this place?" he asked. Wren's voice was low and plain. "I run what needs running." That made him pause. Just half a second. He hadn't expected the flatness, the lack of invitation. The third man finally dismounted. He was taller than the others, but kept his jacket zipped up, still said nothing. Wren's eyes flicked to his hands. No rings, fingernails clean. A small scar at the base of his right thumb. Her gaze returned to the first one. "You boys lost?" she asked. The first man laughed. "Nah, just thirsty. You serve drinks too." "I serve engines," she said. "Bars across the lot." He looked disappointed. Or maybe amused. It was hard to tell. "Then maybe we'll hang out here a while. Could use a little local color." Wren didn't smile, didn't step back. She just folded her arms and let the silence speak for her. They hadn't figured it out yet, that they were on someone else's ground. Not because of a badge, not because of a title, but because she knew how to wait, how to watch, and how to end something before it ever got out of hand. She let the sun warm her face and kept watching. The bar door creaked open, slow and deliberate, followed by a rush of heat and dust as the three men stepped inside. Laughter followed them, not the deep, genuine kind that rides in from a good story, but something thinner, sharper, the kind that doesn't last once the room stops being theirs. It bounced off the wood-paneled walls and clashed with the low hum of the jukebox playing a song that had been stuck in rotation for years. Wren was already sitting at the far end of the bar, nursing a soda, a habit she'd kept from days when she needed to be sharp without looking like she was waiting. She didn't turn around when they entered. The mirror behind the bar gave her everything she needed. Their faces, their posture, the way they walked in too fast and spread out like they were marking territory. The tall one went first, the other two flanked behind. His boots thudded against the worn floorboards, each step too heavy, too purposeful, like he wanted the weight of it to mean something. He saw her the moment he entered, didn't even pretend to glance around first, his eyes fixed on her like someone who'd found a point of interest and didn't want to let it out of sight. Not a leer, not admiration, just that calculating kind of stare, the kind that latches on for sport. Wren felt it, not like a chill, more like a shift in the bar's gravity. A slow awareness settling into her shoulders. He kept looking. She reached for her glass and took a sip, eyes still on the mirror. She didn't let the movement feel like a response, just a rhythm, just another Tuesday. The bartender, an old man named Leo, who knew when not to talk, wiped down the counter and glanced up when the laughter didn't stop. He clocked the three strangers in one look, then turned to Wren with a slight nod. He didn't say anything, but his hand slowed near the phone. The men took stools midway down the bar, 2 seats apart, leaving the tall one closest to her end. The second leaned forward and slapped the bar twice. "Coldest thing you've got," he said, not quite looking at Leo. The third remained silent, fingers drumming a beat on the wood, watching the room like he didn't want to be there but wouldn't say so. The tall one didn't order. He just sat, shoulders squared toward Wren, one boot tapping lightly against the bar rail. "You local?" he asked, voice gravelly but clear, not shouting, not soft. Wren didn't answer. He smiled, like he expected that. Tapped his fingers once, then tried again. "You fix cars, I can tell. Hands don't lie." Still, she said nothing. He turned to Leo. "She always this friendly?" Leo didn't answer either, just slid a bottle down the bar with practiced precision. It landed in front of the second man, who twisted the cap off and leaned back with a smirk. "She's got the kind of hands that say she doesn't take nonsense," the tall one said, this time more to himself than anyone else. Wren finished her drink, stood up slowly, and left the empty glass on a coaster. The stool didn't scrape when she stepped a weight, lifted quiet, controlled. He watched her the whole time, not with aggression, not yet, but with that simmering curiosity that came from needing to prove something. Some men looked for fights. Others looked for someone to recognize their power. He looked like the type who didn't care what she got. As long as he got a reaction, she passed behind him, without looking directly his way, no eye contact. Just enough space to keep things neutral. But she felt it how he shifted, slightly turning, tracking her with his peripheral vision, not wanting to lose sight even for a second. Outside, the sun had dropped lower in the sky. Heat still clung to the gravel lot, but the wind had cooled. Slightly, Wren crossed the lot slowly, heading back toward the garage with no more urgency than the clouds crawling overhead. Behind her, through the open door, the laughter faded again. That kind of laughter never lasted long, not when it wasn't real. And the look in his eyes, she'd seen it before, not once, many times. He was watching her like someone choosing a story to write. What he didn't know was that she'd already written his ending. The wrench clicked softly with each turn, a rhythm Wren could feel through the bones of her wrist. Tighten, adjust, lock. She was crouched beside a lifted F-251 knee on the mat, the other foot planted flat for balance. The undercarriage was rusted in spots, the axle a mess of grit and long-neglected grease. But she worked methodically, her hand finding the right socket without needing to check the label. She didn't hum. She didn't talk to herself. She worked in silence, her breath even, her motions quiet and practiced. From across the lot, laughter drifted again, forced high, the kind that tried too hard to say, "We belong here." The bikers had drifted back out of the bar after 20 minutes inside, drawn not by the drinks, but by the spectacle they hoped to create. The kind that made bystanders uncomfortable enough to watch, but not enough to step in. Boots before she saw them, gravel shifting under deliberate steps, the tall one, as always, leading. The others flanked behind like shadows with volume. One lit a cigarette and took a drag like it was a performance. "Hey there, sweetheart," the first voice called out. "Didn't know they let pretty things under trucks out here." Wren didn't look up. The socket wrench turned again. One last rotation. She double-checked the torque by feel habit, drilled into her by years of repetition. Long before she ever worked in a town like this, she adjusted her grip, reached for the next tool, and continued working. "You deaf or just rude?" Another voice added, closer now. She slid out from under the truck on the creeper board. SLOW and unbothered. Her coveralls streaked with oil, her gloves blackened at the palms. She sat up and reached for the rag she always kept tucked in her back pocket, wiped her hands. Not fast, not slow, just calmly. The tall one crouched slightly, his hands on his knees, trying to meet her eyeline. His sunglasses reflected the sun just enough to block the expression beneath them, but the smirk in his voice didn't need to be seen. "Girl like you, alone out here ought to at least smile when someone's being friendly." Still, Wren said nothing. She stood, slow and precise, her eyes never leaving the truck's side panel. She walked to the workbench, lifted apart an old filter housing and set it down again. Her silence wasn't shy. It wasn't dismissive. It was colder than that. Studied, she moved like someone measuring weight, not words. One of them chuckled, the younger one maybe, and said something under his breath about tight bolts and tighter women. The second one laughed like it was the best joke he'd heard all week. Wren picked up a socket extension and ran her thumb along its teeth, inspecting for wear. Her hand was steady. Her shoulders were relaxed. But behind her stillness, something else moved, something slow, calculating, and far older than whatever game they thought they were playing. "You always this much fun?" the tall one asked, leaning against the side of the truck now, close enough to smudge the door with his jacket. "Or do we have to buy you dinner first to get a full sentence?" This time she turned, not fast, just one movement, clean and straight. Her eyes met his, and the reflection of his own smirk disappeared in the quiet behind hers. "You, leaning on a customer's truck?" she said, voice low and flat. "That's not mine. Step off." He blinked once, maybe twice, straightened just slightly. "That's so?" he asked, but the weight in his voice had shifted. The second one, trying to recover the edge, barked a laugh. "Feisty," he said. "She's got bark." Wren didn't reply. She just stepped forward and picked up the socket wrench again, walked past them, crouched down, slid under the truck without. Another word. The moment stretched. They didn't follow her. The only sound now was the soft metallic click of the wrench. Steady, final dot, and somewhere in that sound, they began to sense it, not fear, not yet, but unease. Like stepping into a current they hadn't noticed was there until it moved beneath them. The storm wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The wall was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Tucked between the cigarette machine and the swinging door that led to the kitchen. It ran the length of the bar's east side, wood-paneled and worn smooth by years of smoke and conversation. Above it, a row of photographs framed in mismatched sizes held the history of men who had passed through some not. Their faces were proud, young, mostly serious. Some were smiling in that forced way people do when they're about to leave something behind. Army, Navy, Marines, a few black and white photos near the top, faces blurred by time, medals barely visible on their chests. Regulars knew the wall, but they didn't really talk about it. It was like furniture, respected, but not discussed. A few would raise a glass now and then and nod toward one of the older photos. Good man, someone might say, quietly, when a name came up that hadn't been spoken in a while. But most just let the silence settle. It was that kind of place, and near the end of the wall, half covered by the glare of the neon Budweiser sign, there was a photograph no one ever asked about. Not directly. She looked out from the frame with a face that didn't smile and didn't need to, young, maybe mid-20s, jaw tight, eyes narrowed under the weight of a patrol cap. The fatigues weren't like the others' no-dress blues, no graduation medals. Hers were lived-in, streaked with dust. There was a patch on her shoulder, partly visible, the kind no one in town could name, even if they noticed it. The photo was smaller than most. No plaque, no caption. The bar owner, Leo, had nailed it up himself nearly a decade ago. Didn't tell anyone why, just hammered it into the wood and stepped back. Some folks noticed, some didn't. Those who asked got a shrug. "She's from here," was all he'd say. Then he'd change the subject. But the people who watched closely, people like Leo, saw things others didn't. Like how Wren always paused when she walked by that side of the bar. Never long, never obvious, but enough. Her eyes would find the photo for a second, maybe two, and then she'd move on. The young woman in the picture didn't look much like the Wren who bent over engines now. The hair was pulled tighter, the frame leaner, but the stare was unmistakable, steady, unyielding, like she was seeing through whoever stood behind the camera. That stare had been trained into her. Or maybe it had always been there, and someone had just taught her how to aim it. No, one asked if that was her. No one wanted to ask the wrong thing and get nothing in return. He remembered the day she brought the photo in, wrapped in a folder, quiet, without explanation. She handed it over and asked if he had space for it. No ceremony, no pride, just the need to place it somewhere it wouldn't be forgotten. He understood. Without needing the words, "Here's good," he'd said, pointing to the bare spot beside the World War II vet who used to sit in the back corner booth. Wren gave one small nod, turned, and walked out. From that day on, no one touched the frame, not even to dust. The bikers hadn't noticed the wall yet. When they came in earlier, they laughed too loud, ordered with too much swagger, took up space, without taking it in. But the third one, the quiet one, he'd glanced at the photos, just once. His eyes had passed over each frame, pausing on the unnamed woman for half a second longer than the rest. He hadn't said anything, but he looked again on his way out. Slower that time. That wall had seen more than it shared, and the girl in fatigues. She wasn't just another name in glass and wood. She was still here, still watching, and if they'd known what that look meant, what it had meant in places far from this bar, they might have thought twice before calling her sweetheart. The screen door banged open against the frame as they stepped back inside, boots trailing dust across the worn wood floor. The tallest one shouldered past the narrow doorway without so much as adjusting his stance, knocking over a bar stool with a clatter that echoed through the quiet space. He didn't look down, just kept walking, like the noise was part of his entrance. The other two followed, slower now, their amusement rippling just beneath the surface. Not laughter this time, just that low, knowing energy that people carry when they think they've already won something. Leo stood behind the bar, wiping down a pint glass with a rag that had seen better days. He didn't stop, didn't speak. He watched them like a man watching a wind shift, sensing the pressure change before the storm hits. His eyes slid past the first two men and settled on the third, the quiet one. But it wasn't the strangers who held his gaze. It was the figure standing just inside the door, still half in shadow. Wren hadn't moved. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed loosely, her expression unreadable. The light from outside caught the edge of her cheek, making her look more like a reflection than a person. Still rooted. Not blocking the door, not welcoming either. Just there. Watching, the tall one dropped himself onto the bar stool closest to the taps. It spun once, then wobbled back into place. He slapped the bar twice and said, "Whiskey? Whatever's not in plastic." His voice carried too far in the stillness. The air inside the bar felt taut, stretched thin by something unspoken. The second man followed suit, settling onto a stool to down, resting his elbows wide across the counter like it belonged to him. The third hung back again, lingering just shy of the jukebox, fingers twitching in his pockets. He looked at Wren. Once just a glance and then looked away. Leo didn't rush. He set the glass down, reached beneath the bar, and pulled out a bottle without looking at it. He poured a finger into a lowball, slid it across to the first man, then another for the second. No garnish, no ice, no price mentioned. Neither man reached for their wallets. Instead, the tall one raised his glass with a lopsided smirk. "Now that's hospitality," he said, then tossed it back in one motion. The second followed. The sound of the glasses hitting wood wasn't loud, but it broke the room's silence like a crack in plaster. Wren still hadn't moved. Leo looked at her just once, brief and quiet, like a man checking a clock he didn't wear. She didn't return the glance. Her eyes were on the tall one now, not in challenge, just a kind of waiting. The way you watch something to see how much longer it'll last before it collapses under its own weight. You always serve without asking. "The tall one?" asked Leo, turning his body slightly to make sure the bartender saw the breadth of him sometimes. Leo said, "Depends who's asking." "Right answer," the man chuckled. The stool he'd knocked over earlier still lay on its side, forgotten, its leg bent awkwardly against the floor. Nobody moved to fix it. The bartender didn't bend down. The bikers didn't notice. And Wren, she just let the moment hang, her silence drawing a line through the room. The second man leaned forward, his voice lower now. "She always this quiet?" he asked, nodding toward Wren without looking directly at her. Leo didn't answer. The jukebox clicked over to another song. A slow blues guitar moaned into the tension, giving the air something to settle into, but it didn't help. The silence around her was thicker than the music could cut. She finally took one step forward, not toward the bar, not toward the men, just one step. Her boots sounded solid on the floor. The tall one turned his head. "Something on your mind, sweetheart?" he asked, the edge returning to his voice. She didn't answer, just looked at him, eyes steady. And then, with absolute calm, she reached down, lifted the fallen stool with one hand, and set it upright without a sound. She didn't glance at him again, didn't change her posture, just walked slowly toward the far end of the bar, took a clean rag from the rail, and began wiping down the empty tables near the back. The message was clear. She wasn't afraid of him, but she wasn't interested in pretending either. The drink they didn't pay for still sat empty between them, the weight of its silence thicker than the liquor it had held. They laughed loud to loud for a place like this. Too loud for a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was heavy with heat and the jukebox played something slow. Their voices bounced off the tin ceiling and stained walls, filled with a kind of careless noise that came from men who hadn't learned to be quiet when they should have. The tall one slapped the counter again, this time not for a drink, but for attention, like the place owed him its ears. "You believe that?" he barked, elbowing. The second man, 25 stitches, didn't even go to the hospital, just duct tape and bourbon. The second man laughed along, the sound brash and proud, both of them circling stories that got taller each time they told them. They weren't talking to anyone in particular, but their voices carried like they wanted anyone to listen. They bragged with the confidence of men who had never been cornered, never sat in a place where silence meant survival. In the back corner, Wren wiped the same table twice. The cloth moved in circles, slow and exact, but her mind was far from the grain of the wood. She heard them, of course, every word, every rise and fall of their voices. She heard the way they tried to stretch a harmless story into something bigger, something that made them feel important in a place that didn't care. They had no idea what room they'd walked into. There was a time, not that long ago, when Wren stood in a gravel field under moonlight with 6 men surrounding her, all of them 20 pounds heavier, younger, faster, and scared. She taught them how to vanish, not just disappear, blend into terrain until they were part of the background. She'd led exercises where they moved without sound, made decisions without light, breathed in patterns to mask their presence from drones. She'd once taught a lieutenant how to map escape routes with nothing but wind, direction, and memory. Another time, she'd stood over a blindfolded recruit, shaking with fear, and told him to make a decision. Any decision before someone else made it for him. There were no second chances out there, only instinct and the ability to commit. Half of them didn't make it through her course. The ones who did still sent her messages from postings around the world, thank yous that never used her name. Now she wiped tables in a roadside bar. Now she fixed trucks and mufflers and replaced timing belts for people who barely looked her in the eye. But some part of her deep-oiled and watchful had never left that field. She didn't look at the bikers. Not yet. She didn't need to. The tall one carried himself like a man who'd never been hunted. The second one laughed like he'd never had to sleep with one eye open. And the third, the quiet one still, hadn't said a word. He didn't laugh, just sipped his drink and watched his friends burn their own fuse shorter with each story. Wren moved to the next table, her movements still slow. Controlled, she caught Leo's glance from behind the bar. It wasn't a question, it was acknowledgement. They both knew what was happening here. They both knew the type. She once told a young sergeant, fresh out of college and full of theories, that the loudest man in the room was usually the one with the weakest plan. That a strong hand didn't need to bang the table to be felt. He'd laughed, too, back then, till she dropped him to the mat in less than 5 seconds. He never laughed during drills again. The bikers didn't know that story. They didn't know any of them. They didn't know how she'd learned to fight with silence, how she'd chosen not to carry a weapon because she never needed to, how her body knew 26 ways to end a threat without a sound. They laughed like the world had never taught them loss, like pain was a choice they could always walk away from. Wren folded the rag neatly in her hand. She wasn't angry. Not yet, but storms rarely started with thunder. The sun had shifted by then, casting longer shadows across the lot. The day was dragging its heels toward evening, but the heat still clung to everything metal, pavement, skin. Wren was back under the hood of the F250, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a streak of grease trailing across her forearm like a badge no one had pinned. The engine was nearly there. A stubborn belt had given her trouble, but she'd coaxed it back into place with a mix of patience and quiet resolve. Behind her, the sound of boots on gravel returned, heavier this time, slower, not the stride of someone passing through, but of someone closing distance. She didn't turn. Instead, she reached for the torque wrench, gauging the tension by feel, the familiar resistance of metal, giving way just enough to let her know it was locked. Her jaw was relaxed, her eyes focused, and then his voice cut through the heat like a blade dulled from overuse. Well, look at that! The oil princess at work." The words dripped with something more than amusement, the kind of tone used to provoke, to pull, a reaction from someone who hadn't given one. He was closer than he should have been, the shadow of him now stretching over her workbench, cast long and crooked by the setting sun. His hands didn't touch anything, not yet, but they hovered. Restless. Wren didn't speak. She just reached out, placed the torque wrench down on the bench, and then slowly, with deliberate care, straightened it. The tool made a soft sound as it touched the surface metal on metal clean. Final, she brushed her fingertips along the edge, aligning it to the others. The entire gesture took less than 5 seconds, but it carried weight. Precision wasn't just habit for her, it was language. He didn't get it. "Come on now," he said, his breath a little too close to the side of her face. "You work like a man, but you smell better." She turned then, just her head. Her eyes met his, and there was nothing in them. Not anger, not fear, just clarity, like the sky before a storm breaks. He grinned at that, like he'd won something. Like the flicker of acknowledgement was all he'd been after. "You always this serious?" he asked. Still, she didn't answer, but her stance had shifted. Her shoulders remained level, but the line of her spine had locked into something firmer. She stood fully upright, took one slow step toward the bench, and reached for a smaller tool flathead, well worn with the handle fraying at the edge. She didn't pick it up to use it. She picked it up because it was hers. "Real?" he asked, the words landing like ash, or just pretend to. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her voice, when it came, was flat as gravel. "You got something broken you want fixed?" He laughed, a short bark that drew attention. From the bar porch where Leo leaned half-hidden behind the screen, the laughter died quickly though. It always did, in that kind of silence. "Easy, sweetheart," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Just saying. A girl like you, out here in the sticks, working alone, you gotta expect some attention." "I don't," she said, voice even that hung between them. Then he leaned in farther, one elbow on the bench. His fingers grazed a socket set like he was entitled to touch anything he saw. That was the line. Wren reached out, took the socket from under his hand, and placed it back with the others. Again, straight, again clean. He stood upright, no longer smiling. Something had shifted finally. He felt it, the weight of something he didn't understand. The heat no longer belonged to the weather. She stepped around him, slow, boots crunching against the gravel, and made her way back to the truck. There was no tension in her walk, because tension is what you feel when you're unsure. Wren was never unsure. Wren was never unsure. Not anymore. The stool at the end of the bar creaked as the old truck driver shifted his weight. The leather seat cracked with age and years of silent observation. He'd been sitting there since just after noon, nursing the same glass of iced tea condensation, pooling in a small ring beneath it. He wasn't a regular in the traditional sense, didn't come every day, didn't talk much, but he was part of the place, the kind of man people nodded to without needing to remember his name. They called him Hank, or maybe that was just what stuck. No one ever asked for a last name. He watched with the same patience he once used to read the road, the kind of attention that knew how to track motion through a rearview mirror or tell the weight of a trailer by how it groaned up a hill. Now that focus was fixed on her. Wren. He hadn't heard anyone call her that until a few months after she first showed up in town. No introduction, no backstory, just a job application at the garage and a work ethic that silenced questions before they could form. But Hank recognized the way she moved before he ever learned her name. There were things that didn't fade with time, how a person carried weight in their step, how their head turned just slightly before their body followed, reflex, not performance. He watched her now through the thin glaze of his glasses, eyes trained on the gravel lot outside as she slid back under the truck. A socket clicked into place, clean, deliberate. Her arms extended, worked the bolt, disappeared again beneath the chassis. Not hurried, not showy, just efficient. The tall biker was still lingering near the bench, jaw tight now, the easy grin gone. He didn't touch anything else, but his presence lingered like the taste of metal and water. The other two loitered closer to the porch, watching their leader like dogs, unsure whether to chase or stay. Hank took a long sip, the ice barely clinking in the glass, and leaned back against the wall, his hands gnarled and thick from decades. On the road, rested quietly on the bar, but his thoughts were turning. He'd seen her before. Not here, not in this exact town. Years ago, along the eastern route outside Fayetteville, in a small motor pool tucked beside an army base, he was delivering a load of surplus parts tires. Brake drums, crates of gear he never asked about. It was late, raining, the kind of Carolina rain that turned gravel into soup and made time crawl. She was there then, younger, face sharper, same eyes. He remembered because of how she gave orders, not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. She didn't ask anyone to do something. Twice, she stood in the rain without flinching, hair plastered to her forehead, pointing at crates and snapping commands like she didn't have time to explain twice. The men, young, armed, disciplined, moved fast under her direction. One of them called her ma'am, and she didn't correct him. It wasn't just how she stood, it was how they listened. He never asked questions. He just remembered now, watching her tighten bolts, while 3 overgrown boys with bikes played at dominance. He felt something in his gut coil the way it did before a jackknife on black ice, a warning, not for him, for them. She hadn't raised her voice once, hadn't puffed up, hadn't pushed back. That was the thing about people who'd seen too much. They didn't bluff, they just waited. He took another sip, gaze steady on the lot. The sun was slipping low now, casting long shadows across the gravel. The breeze carried the faint smell of oil and dry weeds. The jukebox played something old and slow, like it knew to stay quiet. The tall one finally turned away from the tool bench, muttered something to his friends. Hank didn't catch the words, but he read the posture. Frustration, a bruised kind of confusion. They still thought they were circling a lamb. They didn't see the scars. Beneath the fleece, Hank set his glass down, wiped the moisture from his fingers, and kept watching. He wouldn't interfere. She didn't need that, but he stayed, because he knew exactly what kind of storm she was. The sound of metal settling echoed from beneath the truck as Wren slid the creeper out from under the chassis. One last click of a ratchet, one final inspection of the belt tension, and then silence. She wiped her hands on the rag tucked into her waistband, the motion practiced, unconscious. When she stood, there was no dramatics, just a fluid shift of weight. Knees rising first, hands bracing on the side of the truck. Then the rest of her rising like breath, held and released, her shoulders squared automatically, not puffed up, not postured, just aligned. The way bones are meant to sit when they've been trained to carry more than weight. The kind of stance you don't earn from lifting in front of mirrors or counting reps between flexed glances. This was built over years of repetition that didn't include music or warm-ups. Years of learning to move precisely so you don't get noticed or so you get noticed only. When you decide to be seen, she moved around the truck slowly, hand brushing the hood just once, checking the heat. The engine was still ticking its way. Down from the last run, warm metal shrinking back into place. Her steps were quiet on the gravel. Her boots didn't stomp. They didn't need to. The posture of someone who already knows the space. The porch creaked behind her. A chuckle, faint confused, came from the direction of the bikers. One of them had leaned back against the wood beam. Just thought of a clever thing to say, but wasn't sure it was worth saying yet. The tall one had his hands on his hips now, watching her like he couldn't decide if she was worth continuing the show for. She didn't look at them. She opened the side cabinet instead, sorting tools back into their proper place. Socket in the tray, ratchet in the cradle, everything in its line. The sound of steel on steel had its own rhythm and broken, unbothered. She paused once, let her hand rest on the drawer. Then she turned. Leo was watching her from inside the bar, cleaning another glass, moving slower than usual. The old truck driver at the end hadn't shifted, still silent. Still there, she stepped back toward the workbench, grabbing a jug of coolant, unscrewing the cap with a soft hiss, and poured steadily into the reservoir without a single drop missing. When the bottle emptied, she tossed it into the recycling bin behind her. Without turning to see where it landed, the tall one finally stepped forward again. "You always move like that?" he said, voice cutting across the space like it was casual. like you're about to salute someone. She didn't respond. He waited a beat, then tried again. I asked you a question, sweetheart. Her eyes lifted to meet his. There was nothing sharp in her expression. No anger, just a stillness that wasn't hollow, it was deep. She took a step forward, not fast, not slow, just certain. He shifted without meaning to. Weight moving to one foot. People like him didn't realize when they did that it was small, nearly invisible, but Wren saw it. She always did. Her arms hung loose by her sides, shoulders relaxed, elbows bent just slightly, as if halfway to a stance she hadn't needed in years but hadn't forgotten. Her chin was level, eyes steady, not locked onto him, but through him. Reading breath, muscle twitch, shoe placement. Muscle memory isn't just what you do when you're thinking. It's what your body does when you're not. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. Wren walked past him, calm, cool, the scent of grease and metal still clinging to her sleeves. She didn't glance over her shoulder, didn't need to. The ground behind her remained untouched. She hadn't needed to leave a mark, just a change in air pressure, the kind that settles before something breaks. The sound of wind against the garage door brought it back. Not all at once, not like a movie reel snapping into motion, more like a slow bleed of smell, a pressure in the jaw, the angle of light across her boots. Wren stood with one hand on the edge of the workbench, not gripping, just anchoring. The voices outside blurred into a distant hum, and her mind slipped to a place where the ground was red clay and the air always smelled of wet canvas and sweat. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It had rained for days that week, turning the training field into something halfway between swamp and punishment. She remembered the sharp sting of water down her back, the chill that lived between the shoulder blades no matter how tight the uniform was cinched. Recruits stumbled through drills in the muck, legs burning, lungs wide open and raw from shouting. She hadn't shouted. She rarely needed to. Wren had learned early that silence carried a different kind of command. When you didn't fill space with noise, people leaned in. They paid attention. She'd walk the line slowly, boots moving through the flooded field like she wasn't getting soaked to the bone. One tap on the shoulder, one nod. The recruit would straighten, correct, adjust. She could strip a rifle faster than most of the men she trained could disassemble, clear, and reassemble with gloved hands in under 20 seconds while shouting instructions to two others. Not because she was the best, because she trained past exhaustion. Because she knew failure wasn't just an option, it was always waiting, just one slow heartbeat away. There had been a recruit Rodrigueziger, fast, too fast, too fast, always moving ahead of instruction, hands working before his mind had locked in. She stopped him during a field maneuver, crouched next to him in the underbrush while the others fanned out, told him to hold, to breathe, to listen. He asked her how she always knew where people were. She didn't answer. Instead, she had him close his eyes, listened to the direction of the wind. The difference in bird calls, the off-rhythm footfall of someone trying too hard not to be heard. 30 seconds later, she reached forward and grabbed a hidden observer by the collar. Rodriguez never questioned silence again. The coolant jug settled with a soft plastic creak. Wren blinked, the memory not fading so much as tucking itself back beneath the surface. Her spine still held the tension of field gear. Her fingers still knew the feel of mud-covered metal. Every knuckle remembered pressure points. Every shoulder remembered recoil. There was a night she thought about often. Late rotation, cold enough for breath to hang in fog. They were doing blind disarm drills, no light, full gear, simulated ambush. The trainee didn't know it was her in the dark. Came in fast, strong, textbook grip. She let the move start, let it build just enough, then turned him inside out in 2 steps, and dropped him face first into the dirt. She didn't celebrate, she just told him how he could have lost his knife hand. He thanked her the next day. Called her ma'am, she made him do the drill again. This time, she came at him from below. Now, years later, standing in a place where people only knew her for torque specs and socket sets, those echoes still sat inside her. Not nostalgia, not pride, just muscle knowledge that never dulled. She could still hear the cadence of boots in formation, the rain on her helmet, the static hiss before a radio came alive. All of it lived in the quiet between breaths. The stillness she carried like a second skin. Outside, the bikers were shifting again. Their laughter had dulled. The sun was lower now. Wren rolled her shoulders once, small motion. Spine aligning back into the present. The memory receded. But it never left. It never needed to. The late afternoon light stretched long across the gravel lot, pulling shadows into shapes that didn't match the bodies casting them. Wren had just finished wiping down the last of her tools when the tall one walked back toward the bench. Swagger, thick in his shoulders. His boots scraped loud against the grit, the kind of sound made by someone trying to be noticed. The other two hung back near the porch, arms crossed, watching with half smirks and the lazy interest of people who believed nothing would happen that they couldn't laugh off later. He didn't speak at first, just stood near the bench, looming, fingers tapping against his belt buckle. She caught his reflection in the chrome of the toolbox lid-tight jaw. Narrowed eyes, the kind of face someone wears when they need to prove something. To themselves, or to their crew. Wren didn't give him that. She kept her back to him and reached for the torque wrench, ready to return it to its proper place. That's when it happened. His hand shot out. Fast and loud. The wrench went flying off the table, spinning once in the air before clattering hard onto the concrete. The sharp metallic sound echoing across the lot like a shot. The bar fell silent. No music from the jukebox. No scraping forks. Just stillness. He stepped in closer, lips curling. "What are you gonna do, grease monkey?" he sneered, his voice soaked in mockery. "Gonna cry? Maybe call for your boyfriend?" Wren didn't move for the wrench. She didn't blink. Instead, she turned around, slowly. Her hands hung at her sides, fingers relaxed. Her shoulders were still square, body loose like something that didn't need tension to be ready. She looked up at him, just a few inches shorter, but unmoved. There wasn't fear on her face. There wasn't anything, and that was the problem. He expected fire, a spark, something he could build a scene from. Instead, he got a wall. A blank, unyielding. A surface that didn't react to provocation. It unsettled him in a way he didn't know how to name. So he did what men like him often did. He doubled down. "You think hiding behind a toolbox makes you tough?" He laughed. Louder now, louder than he needed to be. "You're just a girl with a socket wrench." No one in the bar spoke. Leo stood just behind the screen door, towel in his hands. Frozen. The old truck driver hadn't moved an inch. Wren finally broke the silence. "I don't need the wrench," she said, voice low, clear. The biker snorted. "Oh yeah? What do you need then, sweetheart?" She took one step forward, just one. And in that single step, something shifted in the air. It wasn't posture or threat. It was something more subtle, an economy of movement. Like the way a hawk folds its wings right before diving. Compact, controlled, predictable, only to those who knew what to look for. He felt it, not consciously, but enough to make his jaw twitch. She didn't raise her hands, didn't ball her fists. She didn't need to, because her stillness said everything. The kind of stillness earned through drills, through late nights in training fields where failure meant pain and success meant starting over. The kind that told anyone with enough experience, "This isn't someone you push," but he hadn't seen that before, and he still didn't understand it yet. Behind them, the wind picked up slightly, kicking dust into small curls near the wheels of the parked bikes. Wren stood her ground, not defiant, just ready, and for the first time, the tall one hesitated, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. The wrench still lay on the concrete floor, a silver crescent glinting beneath a slant of late sun. Dust settled softly around it, as if the moment had paused long enough to let the air decide what came next. The tall biker stood less than 2 feet from her now, breath laced with beer and something older, something sour. He squared his shoulders like a man about to make a point. Wren blinked. Just once, not fast, not slow. Just a single blink measured. Calm and utterly devoid of fear. Inside the bar, the hum of conversation dropped out completely. Even the jukebox, which had been playing something twangy and forgettable, clicked off mid-track as if the machine itself had grown self-conscious. The pool cue stopped midway in one man's hand, suspended before it struck the ball. The bartender stilled, rag in one hand, the other clutching the counter. And at the end of the bar, the old truck driver tightened his grip around his coffee cup, his fingers stiffening so slowly it might have gone unnoticed. But it didn't. The flinch never came. That was what made it different. The tall biker had counted on it. The flinch, the instinctive recoil, the shift backward, the hesitation. Even the smallest tell that he had landed inside her space, and she didn't know how to hold it, but it never happened. Wren didn't twitch, didn't rock on her heels. Her eyes didn't flick to an exit, to a weapon, to a witness. She blinked, and then she just kept looking at him. No fear, no permission. And something in him deep, bone level, registered that absence as a threat more chilling than any weapon. Still, his pride pushed him forward. He leaned in, voice low. "You got a death wish," he said, smirking just enough to cover the doubt. Wren exhaled, but it wasn't heavy, it was light. A breath the body takes when it's already chosen the next move. "No," she said. It wasn't a line. It wasn't for drama. It was information. The kind you give someone because, at one point, long ago, you were taught to give a warning first. A moment for someone to recalculate their path. She was still giving him that dot for now. The old man at the bar sipped his coffee, never looking away. His left thumb tapped the side of the mug in rhythm once, twice, like he was counting something. Or praying. The tall biker's grin faltered, just slightly. Enough to show teeth in a way that wasn't confident anymore, just confused. He stepped back. A half step, unintended. Wren didn't follow. She didn't need to. Her stance hadn't changed. But somehow, the space around her had. She was no longer the one inside his reach. He was the one inside hers. The balance had shifted, and even the other two bikers began to sense it watching from the porch, now with crossed arms dropped just a bit lower, mouths tightening, unsure if this was still funny. It wasn't. The tall one let out a huff. Trying to reclaim the narrative, "Just a damn mechanic," he muttered. And again she didn't correct him, didn't tell him what her rank used to be, didn't list deployments or training fields, or the long black hours spent teaching others how to disarm with fingers, not bullets. She let the moment hang, just long enough for the weight of what didn't happen to press against everyone watching. No punch, no shout, no flinch, just stillness. And somehow, that was louder than anything she could have said. The gravel crunched softly beneath her boots, the sound barely audible but unmistakable in the quiet that had settled over the lot. Wren took one step forward, not fast, not theatrical, but final, the kind of step that didn't ask for attention, simply received it. The tall biker shifted back instinctively, masking it by turning slightly to the side, pretending to study the wrench still lying on the ground. His jaw tensed. She didn't break her line. Her voice, when it came, didn't rise. Didn't try to dominate the space. It didn't need to. The words were clean, pared down to their spine. Don't touch anything else. There was no tremble. In it, no edge of warning. Just a suggestion so firm, it wasn't really a suggestion at all. He blinked at her once, twice, the kind of blink that happens when someone's brain tries to recalibrate and fails to find the manual. His hands flexed at his sides, one drifting up, as if by muscle memory, toward a chain on his belt. That was when her stance shifted. Subtle, a fraction of weight onto the ball of her back foot, the pivot of a shoulder, the drop of a hand toward her thigh knot, to draw, not to grab, but to center. It was nothing and everything at once. And anyone trained to see the cue would have understood immediately the move was already happening, even if no punch had been thrown yet. The space between them had collapsed without sound. The tall biker didn't move. Behind him, his buddies had fallen quiet. One had straightened from the porch post and moved a half step down the stairs, unsure whether this was still his friend's moment or something none of them had signed up for. Wren's eyes didn't leave him. Her voice hadn't changed, but her presence had. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore, not in his eyes, not in anyone's. Something had bled through the surface, a presence, a readiness. The air itself seemed to respond to her stillness, the tension hanging just low enough to notice and just heavy enough to make breathing feel different. The biker tried again, scoffed, low and forced. "You don't give orders out here," he said, chest puffing slightly, but even as the words came out, his eyes flicked toward the wrench. Then her hands bent back to her face. She didn't smile, didn't react at all, did more damage than any insult ever could. He took a half step backward, not retreat, not quite. but not forward either. And Wren let him. She didn't move to close the distance, didn't mock. She didn't need to assert dominance because she hadn't lost it. The first move had already happened. It wasn't a punch, it wasn't a throw. It was a step, a line drawn by someone who knew what lines meant, who knew when to cross them and when to wait on the other side. The moment held, no one in the bar moved. The old trucker's hand stayed firm around his cup. Leo, still behind the counter, exhaled just once through his nose, but nothing else changed. The tall biker looked at her again, saw the quiet in her jawline, the way her body didn't carry. Tension it, stored it, ready, waiting. He turned slightly toward the bikes, mumbling something neither friend seemed eager to respond to. Wren stood there, still arms at her sides. She hadn't raised a hand, but something in the scene had already been written that the first move wasn't a strike, it was a boundary, a line, and she'd drawn it by standing still. His hand clamped down on her shoulder without thought, not with the kind of intent that's sharpened over time, but the kind born from reflex and ego, the kind that comes from years of people not pushing back. His fingers curled hard into the canvas of her coveralls, expecting a twist, maybe a startled step away, expecting a human reaction that made sense to him. What he got was none of that. There was no pause, no recoil, not even a blink this time. Instead, her body moved in a way that wasn't defensive, but fluid-like. The motion had already been prepared long before he reached for her, like it was already part of her breath. His grip on her shoulder didn't meet resistance. It met something worse. It met a lack of resistance. She turned slightly, not to face him, but to give his own force somewhere to go. And then, almost gently, she stepped aside and used that momentum like water escaping a clenched fist. His shoulder followed his hand. His feet scrambled, but they were no longer under him. There was no wind-up, no shout, just the precise transfer of motion, redirected, folded in. Dropped low, his weight carried him forward, and her left arm found his elbow. A slight tug, a pivot of her hips, and then concrete. His knees hit first. Loud, sharp. The air left him in a rush that startled even his friends, still frozen near the porch. His palms slapped the ground a second too late to catch him fully. It wasn't dramatic, but it wasn't soft either. The kind of fall that leaves bruises in the morning and pride in pieces. Wren stepped back, not rushed. She just gave him space to realize where he was. Hands still extended in the empty gesture of a failed grab. Shoulders hunched now, not in aggression, but in confusion. His body tried to understand what had happened, but it wasn't built for this kind of math. Behind him, one of his buddies let out half a laugh. Not at her, at him. Wren didn't look at either of them. Her eyes stayed on the one in front of her. He rose slowly, but not all the way. One hand on his thigh, the other pressed to the ground to steady himself. He didn't lunge again. That thought, whatever shred of it remained, had already drained from his spine when his knees hit the floor. "You moved," he said, voice low, trying to patch his ego with confusion. "No," she said quietly. It wasn't a correction, just the truth. The same kind she used to say in training fields, long before people forgot her name. He stood fully now, but it was different. His chest didn't puff, his arms didn't swing. His jaw moved once, like he wanted to spit out something smart, but the words never came. The other bikers weren't laughing anymore, not because she'd humiliated him, but because she hadn't tried to. That's what rattled them. She didn't humiliate. She didn't perform, she just responded. He stepped backward, one pace. Then, Wren didn't follow. She simply crouched, picked up the wrench off the ground, wiped it once with a cloth hanging from her belt, and returned it to the bench like it had never been part of anything, like it was just a tool again. And somehow, that made the silence feel heavier than the fall. The sound of his knees hitting the concrete still hung in the air, a noise that didn't echo but stayed suspended in memory. Wren turned away from it like she was brushing off dust, not confrontation. She walked back toward the bench, her boots silent against the floor, the wrench still cradled lightly in her hand. Inside the bar, nothing moved. No one cheered, no one clapped. There were no fist pumps or chuckles or celebratory whoops, just the kind of silence that settles in when people realize something real just happened, something they weren't meant to interrupt. The kind of quiet that doesn't invite opinion. The jukebox stayed off. its usual country hum now absent. The two pool players still had cues in their hands, but neither raised them. One rested his stick gently against the table's edge, like it might make noise if placed too hard. The bartender, Leo, held a half-wiped glass frozen between two towels. His hand hovered, unmoving. He didn't even look at Wren just past her through the window, to where the tall biker had backed up like a man who suddenly remembered a prior appointment. At the end of the bar, the truck driver brought his coffee to his lips, but didn't drink. His gaze stayed level, steady, like someone remembering something he'd learned long ago and hoped never to need again. Wren set the wrench back into its drawer with the same care she'd used that morning when organizing sockets. No noise. Number 1, punctuation. Her shoulders relaxed, not out of relief, but routine. There was no adrenaline on her face, no tight breath. This hadn't surprised her. It had just passed. She wiped her hands with a clean rag, thick with years of oil, but folded neatly. In a square, one side, then the other. Between each finger, the smell of engine grease mixed with dust and sunlight in the air, grounding the room in something ordinary. And still, no one spoke. The biker outside still stood, unsure if he should stay or go. The bruise on his ego was beginning to spread across his stance, no longer loose, now stiff and uncertain. His friends watched him but offered no rescue. This wasn't a fight anymore. It wasn't anything they knew how to name. The quiet inside had weight, not just stillness, but reverence, a kind of collective agreement not to disturb the way the moment had settled like sand finally fallen in a jar. It wasn't just about Wren. It was about something else. The realization that someone among them, someone they'd seen almost every day, had a depth they'd never thought to ask about, had moved with a control that didn't come from confidence but conditioning. Years, decades, decisions made in shadows, not show. And now here she was. Wiping down a wrench, the bell above the bar door finally gave a single tired ring as one of the porch bikers stepped inside, slower than before. His eyes scanned the room, looking for something to latch onto, maybe a smirk, maybe a cue to laugh. He found none. Not a face met his that told him this was still a joke, so he didn't speak. Wren walked past him on her way back behind the bar. She didn't make eye contact, didn't brush shoulders. She simply moved through the space that was always hers, though no one had noticed until today. Leo cleared his throat quietly. Still no words, just a sound to remind himself he was still part of this. The truck driver finally sipped his coffee. Outside, an engine tried to start twice, then turned over, but no one rushed to follow it. The quiet in the bar held on longer than anyone expected. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore, it was the silence of respect. The second one didn't hesitate like the first. Maybe that was his mistake. Maybe he thought speed would change the outcome, that if he moved fast enough, angry enough, loud enough, he could undo the quiet that had just settled like dust across the bar. He came in hot, his boots loud against the wooden floor, a curse halfway out of his mouth, a bottle still clutched in one hand. The jukebox caught the worst of it. The bottle missed its intended target entirely and shattered against the chrome casing, sending glass and amber liquid across the floor in a quick, glittering arc. The jukebox sparked once, fizzed, and fell dark again. One of the pool players ducked out of instinct, even though he was too far to be in danger. The rest of the bar didn't flinch. Wren had already moved. She didn't run. She didn't brace. She simply pivoted left, foot sliding half a step, hips turning, left hand coming up in a controlled arc, palm catching his forearm before the next swing ever landed. The motion was clean. Her grip found the middle of his forearm like she'd been reaching for it all day. He tried to push through it. Most people would have expected that reaction to double down, yank harder, swing again with more force. But her hold wasn't about resistance. It was about redirection. That was the part he didn't understand. She didn't block him. She invited him into his own mistake. His body followed his momentum, arm wide, off balance. And then she turned it not hard, not sudden, just enough. The wrist bent backward at a precise angle. The elbow nudged upward against its natural hinge, and the shoulders suddenly lost all leverage. His hand opened involuntarily. The rest of him went down the way wet cardboard folds in half. There wasn't a thud, no theatrical crash, just the sound of a breath leaving his chest and a low grunt as he dropped to one knee. His free arm shot out to catch the edge of a table, but Wren had already stepped back. 1 second she was at his side, the next, she wasn't. No follow-through, no gloating, just absence. He didn't know what part of his body hurt, yet only that it did. His fingers twitched, not from pain, but confusion, like they were trying to figure out how they'd lost control. From the far end of the bar, Leo finally moved. Not to help, just to sweep the glass from the floor with a slow motion, eyes flicking. Between the biker and the broken jukebox, like this, was cleanup more than concern. The biker looked up from the floor, stunned. One leg sprawled, the other still trying to hold weight. His arm was back in his control, but barely. The joint smarted. He flexed his fingers slowly, as if they might snap back into a position of strength. They didn't. He looked around for backup. His friend hadn't moved. The first biker stood planted just outside the door, arms crossed, jaw locked, watching but not approaching. He'd already learned, and now, so had the second. Wren didn't speak. She walked over to the jukebox, examined the wires near the cracked casing, reached behind it, checked the plug, and gave a soft twist to one of the exposed leads. The screen blinked once and returned to life, flickering faintly to the start of a familiar country track. She tapped the button twice, skipping the song, then she turned away. The music started playing, something low and steady, the kind of background track that knew not to interrupt what had just happened. The second biker rose slowly. His shoulder hung a bit lower now. He didn't reach for another bottle, didn't reach for anything, because in Wren's world, there were no second warnings, just second lessons. The third one didn't move. Not when the first hit the ground, not when the second dropped to one knee. His arm bent in a direction that arms weren't meant to bend. He just watched, arms folded, one boot resting against the wall near the bars. Outer door, Wade shifted slightly to his right. His eyes stayed steady on Wren, not narrowed, not defiant, just steady. The kind of gaze that didn't come from pride or stubbornness, like someone who had already seen the full arc of what could happen because once, a long time ago, he'd been standing somewhere very different, and the result had been the same. He didn't need to ask what Wren had done to move the way she moved. He already knew that posture, the fluidity, the calculation, not rage. It was muscle layered over discipline, not brute strength. It was the kind of training that didn't come in gyms or fight clubs, the kind that was earned under pressure, high stress, real stakes, the kind you either walked away from or didn't. He'd seen it before. Maybe it was Afghanistan. Maybe Fallujah. He didn't talk about it much anymore. No one asked, and he didn't offer. But the way she turned that man's wrist and let gravity do the rest hit brought back something he hadn't seen in years. Not exactly a memory, more like a shape that moved through the corners of his mind. A familiar rhythm. He shifted his weight again, barely. His two friends were down, not injured badly, not broken, but changed. They knew it now what they'd walked into, and more importantly, what they hadn't. The bar was still silent, though the jukebox had returned to life in a low hum. Wren stood near the bench again, not facing the door, not guarding herself, just returning to the position she'd held before any of this started. She wiped her palms with the same rag, folded it once, then again. Every movement normal, deliberate, but not hostile. The third biker finally pushed off the wall. He didn't swagger, didn't challenge. He walked slowly across the porch and stepped inside. His boots hit the floor gently, not soft enough to be timid, but not loud enough to provoke. He stopped halfway in near the jukebox and looked around the room. His eyes settled on the shattered glass, the small pool of beer near the corner, and then the table where the bottle had originally been taken. He bent down, picked up a larger shard, turned it in his hand once, and set it carefully on the table's edge. Then he looked at Wren again. "You ever train out of brag?" he asked, voice low, casual, like someone asking about whether in a town they once passed through. Wren didn't answer at first. She folded the rag a final time, set it down, then met his eyes. Calm, direct. "Used to," she said. He nodded once. That was enough. Not a confirmation of rank or detail, just a breadcrumb. "Figured," he replied. His voice had no edge to it, just understanding. He looked back toward the door, then toward his two friends, one nursing his shoulder, the other still too proud to touch his knee. "You boys ready?" he asked them, not unkindly, not mocking. Neither of them responded, but They moved. The third one looked around the bar, nodded once to the bartender, and gave Wren a final look. Not fear, not challenge, just acknowledgement. He opened the door. Sunlight cut a sharp line across the floor. The three of them left with fewer words than they'd brought. No engine revs, no parting threats, just the sound of boots, gravel, and distance. Wren turned back to her bench, picked up a socket, and resumed her work. For the first time in 20 minutes, the bar breathed again. But nobody tried to fill the silence with words. Stories don't get told out loud. Some are understood just by the way someone doesn't move. The bartender stared at the glass in his hand a moment longer before setting it gently on the counter. The towel followed, folded once, laid neatly beside it. He didn't rush, didn't sigh, just turned toward the phone on the wall, that old beige landline with the coiled cord stretched too many times. It hadn't rung, it didn't need to. Leo had made it a habit years ago to call in advance on Tuesdays around lunch, just in case. Not because of Wrenchy was never the problem, but because of the road. Roadside bars brought road noise, and sometimes road problems. He lifted the receiver, dialed 3 numbers, then paused as the line clicked to life. "Yeah," he said. Without introduction, bar off 11, the one by the old grain station. Cancel that check-in. There was a pause on the other end. Some familiar voice asked something short. Leo nodded slowly, as if the other person could see him. "No, it's all quiet now, nothing worth logging." Another pause. Then he added, "Yeah, handled." He didn't elaborate. Didn't mention the bottle that shattered near the jukebox. The man who tried to yank Wren's shoulder like he was tugging at a door that wouldn't open, or the way the second one now held his arm like it might need checking later. Leo knew the dispatcher. She wouldn't press. They both knew what handled meant. It was the kind of word small towns used instead of paperwork. He hung up gently. The bar hadn't gone back to full motion, but it had softened around the edges. The tension had pulled back into the corners, no longer tight across the floor. One of the pool players took a breath long enough to finish his drink. The old truck driver at the end of the bar gave a slow nod. From his cup, Leo leaned on the bar with both hands, shoulders lowered now. Not from exhaustion, but relief. He glanced toward Wren. She hadn't looked up. She was back at the open hood, socket in hand, tightening something most people couldn't name. Her motion steady, each click purposeful. The same focus she always had, whether she was rewiring an alternator or hauling in engine blocks with a chain hoist. Nothing had changed in her world except the absence of interruption. Leo poured himself a half glass of water. The jukebox buzzed quietly behind him. One speaker crackled, a little glass must have nicked a wire butt. It still played. He made a mental note to check it later, maybe when she was done. Wren moved with rhythm, elbow out, wrist turning, the kind of measured work that came from years of muscle repetition. Leo watched for a second longer, then turned to wipe down. The other end of the bar, still no words exchanged. Behind him, the bar door creaked open just slightly. A local stepped in, a younger guy in a Carhartt jacket with a smudge of paint on his boots. He looked around, puzzled by the stillness. "Everything okay?" he asked, eyes scanning the faces. Leo didn't answer right away. He grabbed a towel and wiped the counter once. "Just missed it," he said flatly. "Missed what?" Leo shrugged, like it wasn't worth pointing out. "Nothing that needs fixing." The younger man raised his eyebrows, but didn't press. He walked to the far side of the bar and slid onto a stool, setting down his keys with a soft jingle. Leo poured him a water. No beer, not yet. Wren reached up and closed the hood. The latch clicked with a clean sound. Her back stayed to the room, but her presence was still the center of it. Not loud, not dominant, just still. Leo picked up the towel again, switched hands. "Handled," he said once more, but this time to no one in particular. She crouched without urgency, reaching for the socket wrench that had rolled under the bench. The floor beneath her was cool concrete, stained with years of oil, boot scuffs, and dropped bolts. As she stretched forward, her sleeve slipped just enough to reveal a small triangle of skin just above the wrist, along the inside of her forearm. A few eyes caught it. Most didn't, but those who did dash paused. It wasn't flashy, not bright or bold like the modern ink younger mechanics wore. On their necks or fingers, it was older, its black lines softened by time and weather, a little blurred at the edges, but the image still held, a sword pointed down through a jagged bolt of lightning, the kind stylized like something off a warning label. Letters curved along the arc of the hilt, faded but not gone. One of the men near the window narrowed his gaze. His beer glass stayed frozen halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, quietly, and kept his eyes on her arm. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. Behind the bar, Leo noticed, too. Not the tattoo. Exactly, he'd seen it before. Years ago when she helped him replace a gas line that burst behind the cooler. But he noticed the eyes it had drawn. Wren didn't. Pull the sleeve back down right away. Maybe she didn't feel it slide. Maybe she did. She stood, tool in hand, and casually rubbed the back of her wrist with her opposite palm. The gesture brought the fabric back over the ink without drama, but the flash had been enough. The man near the window leaned over slightly to the guy next to him, whispered something low. The second man shrugged, didn't know the symbol. Didn't. Care took another sip, but the first man he kept watching. He wasn't young, late 50s, maybe early 60s, the kind of face that had spent time outdoors. Sun-darkened lines, calloused fingers, boots that still carried gravel in their soles. The sword and lightning mark wasn't standard military fare. It wasn't from any branch the public followed with bumper stickers or hats. It wasn't a unit that made the news or turned up on Veterans Day banners. It was older, quieter, special, Forces instructor level quiet. That patch was never issued in bulk. You earned it only after years in, not years near. It belonged to people who trained ghosts, not soldiers. People who'd spent more time behind foreign lines than they had in barracks. Fort Bragg knew it. Langley knew it. But the local VFW wouldn't. Wren adjusted the wrench in her grip and returned to the engine block. One bolt left, torque it, test it, and she'd be done. The man near the window turned back to his drink. But something about the way he sat changed, straighter, more respectful. Not in a way that asked for her attention, but in a way that refused to misunderstand her. Again, she finished tightening the bolt and closed the hood with a final snap. From the doorway, the younger guy in the paint-stained Carhartt blinked toward. The window man, "You good?" The older man gave a faint nod. "Yeah, just remembering something." He didn't explain. The sword through lightning didn't come with stories, just silence, and those who recognized it knew better than to ask. Wren wiped her hands on her coveralls, not rushed, then picked up her rag and hung it on the wall beside the others. Each one folded, each one used, cleaned, and reused again. The bar had returned to the sound of a quiet afternoon, air moving through an old fan. Pool balls rolling across green felt, boots shifting across old wood, and one patch now hidden again. That changed the way a few people sat in their chairs. Outside the bar, the sunlight had begun to settle into the angles of late afternoon, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. A low breeze stirred dust near the edge of the highway, kicking it into small spirals that drifted and vanished before they touched the steps. The open sign in the window flickered faintly, half of the neon red giving out as it always did when the power line rattled loose inside. Wren was by the doorway, cleaning her hands one last time, folding the rag into quarters. Her routine rarely changed. Oil off the fingers, grip wiped dry, cloth folded and placed back on the hook like it mattered. The door creaked a little behind her, held open by the wedge of a cracked brick. She didn't look up at first, but then she did, through the window. Beside the bar beyond, the warped glass pane and the layer of dust that never fully wiped clean stood a man leaning against the side rail of a parked truck. He wasn't tall, wasn't big, just steady, 1 foot braced on the running board. Arms crossed, his jacket was old military issue, the faded kind worn past regulation with threadbare patches no longer meant to be read. His cap was low, shadowing the top half of his face. He didn't raise a hand, he didn't move from the lean, but he nodded once, firm, not exaggerated, not casual. Wren met his eyes, no smile, no shift in posture, just a returned nod, just as slight, just as firm. Inside the bar, nobody noticed. A man at the jukebox was flipping through tracks, the clack of plastic cases adding a low rhythm to the room. A woman at the end of the bar stirred her drink with a straw that had already collapsed. Leo refilled a water glass without lifting his head. Outside, the wind tugged at the hem of the man's coat, brushing it against the side of the truck. His boots were dusty, the heels worn smooth. He said nothing. The look wasn't a signal. It wasn't a message. It was acknowledgement, recognition of something that didn't need to be spoken. Not between them. Wren hadn't seen him in months. Maybe longer, but that didn't matter. These weren't people who kept up with birthdays or barbecues. They didn't send Christmas cards or share old photos. They moved in different lines through different rooms. And every now and then, those paths crossed for just a second. He had once called her instructor and meant it. She had once called him 3 seconds too slow and meant that to Dot. Now they didn't need to call anything. He straightened, slow, and even pulled the brim of his cap just slightly downward, then stepped off the running board and circled the back of the truck. The tailgate creaked as it dropped, but still no one inside seemed to notice. A thud of some unseen gear being shifted inside. The bed echoed lightly, followed by the muffled sound of fabric straps tightening. Wren didn't leave the doorway, didn't call out. She just stood for a moment longer, then finally let the rag rest on the hooked Dot outside. The man closed the tailgate and stepped around to the driver's side. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. The truck rumbled to life, not a roar, just a deep, steady engine that knew how to start without fuss. It rolled out of the lot, tires brushing against the gravel and turning up nothing. No dust cloud, no screech, just quiet departure. Wren stepped back into the garage. There was still work to do. They never asked her name. Not once. Not when she repaired their carburetors in silence. Nor when she slid under leaking suspensions and came out smeared in grease, socket wrench still in hand. They called her sweetheart, darlin', mechanic girl, or sometimes just nodded with a casual, dismissive hey. It didn't matter if she solved the thing that stranded them in the middle of nowhere, or if they returned a second or third time, because no other shop within 50 miles could fix what she did. They never asked. Even the regulars didn't. Not out of cruelty or malice, just out of a lazy familiarity that assumed she was always there, like the bar, like the ice machine that never worked right. They greeted her by title, by gesture, by familiarity, never by name, but her name was still there, etched into polished brass, mounted just above eye level in a long hallway on a base. Across the country, the instructor's wall at Fort Liberty, second column from the right, third row down, Chief Warrant Officer Wren Halstead, 7th Special Forces Group. Instructor Tactical Evasion and Combat Conditioning. Years served, 1999-2017. No fanfare, just facts. That was how those plaques were built. Each name the same height, the same font, the same line spacing. But for those who had walked that corridor after weeks of dragging in mud and bruises from live drills, after hours crawling through pitch-black structures, simulating village corridors or dense jungle compounds, those names meant something. They were the ones you remembered when things went wrong, the ones who corrected your form not because it was sloppy, but because 1 inch off could be your life in the wrong hands, the ones who could spot hesitation in a single blink, who could stop a fight before it began, not with a shout, but with stillness. Wren had trained them in silence, mostly. Few speeches, few lectures, just example after example. The quiet rhythm of pressure points and leverage, timing drills where 2 seconds too late meant you were on your back with a boot pressing your chest. And after each session, when they left the mat sore and quiet, they walked past that same plaque. Some noticed it, some didn't, but the ones who did remembered it. In the bar, she was just the woman with the socket wrench, just the girl in overalls. Just another roadside fixture with calloused hands and a 1,000-yard stare people mistook for distraction. They didn't know the name. They didn't know how many recruits froze up when she walked into the training dome with no visible rank, no smile, and a stopwatch in one hand. Didn't know that her evaluations were used to determine final readiness for deployment. Didn't know that her last week on base, half a dozen soldiers tried to get her to stay. That one now stationed overseas still wore the gait adjustment brace she noticed he needed before he even knew he limped. She didn't need them to know. The plaque was enough. It hadn't changed in the years since she left, not even when Fort Bragg was renamed Liberty. She hadn't gone back. But someone sent a picture once, a former student. A quick photo taken after a training pass, blurry with bad lighting. The message had been simple, still there. Wren had saved the image, but never replied in her garage, surrounded by engine noise and rusted bolts. Her name didn't matter. She liked it that way. She'd had her time with titles, had worn the weight of command of silent assessment. Here, it was different. There was no chain of command, just engines, grease, and quiet. They didn't ask, she didn't offer. But somewhere, behind a locked hallway door on a military base, carved from pine and red clay, her name was carved into brass. And that was enough. The gravel in the parking lot hadn't fully settled since the last tire spun out. Dust hung low in the late afternoon air, catching sunlight like smoke. The silence that followed wasn't complete. It never was out there. Wind tugged at the corner of the old sign above the garage, and someone inside dropped a pool cue that clacked against the concrete. But it was quieter than before, more deliberate. 2 of the bikes left hard, throttles angry, engines loud enough to drown whatever. Unfinished words had been stuck in their throats. They didn't look back, didn't check for each other, just peeled off onto Route 11 in opposite directions, heat shimmering around the exhaust as they disappeared down the road. The third bike didn't move. It was still parked near the edge of the lot where the fence leaned slightly, and the old tire swing from the owner's grandkid still hung useless, forgotten. The bike's chrome caught the light, but it wasn't polished like the others. Its frame bore scratches. Its grips were worn. This one had been used for more than shows and weekends. It had seen time. Its rider didn't speak. He stood there. A long while, helmet still hooked onto the right bar, gloves hanging loosely from the belt loop on his jeans. His boots were planted wide, like a man who had learned long ago how to stand without giving ground. Wren had gone back inside by then. She wasn't watching, but Leo was. Quiet behind the bar, polishing a glass that didn't need it, glancing. Through the streaked front window, without lifting his head, he recognized something in the way the man stood. Not fear, not anger either, something slower. He didn't say a word. Eventually, the man unhooked the helmet, looked at it for a long moment, and set it down on the seat. Not like someone dropping gear, more like someone setting down a story they didn't want to tell anymore. Then he walked, not fast, not like he had somewhere to be, just ... forward. Boots crunching the gravel, one step after the next, toward the road. He passed the rusted-out signpost and kept going. No hitching his thumb out, no calling for a ride. Just a man choosing to walk rather than ride away from something he couldn't unsee. No one followed him. Inside, the bar returned to its old rhythm. The jukebox flickered back on, a scratchy song from a decade most patrons barely remembered. Pool balls clicked again. Someone coughed near the far end, and a trucker dropped a crumpled dollar on the counter without looking up. Wren didn't come. Back out, the man walked until he was a shape in the distance. Then a shadow, then nothing. His bike stayed where it was, sunlight shifting across the gas tank, glinting briefly off a patch on the side of the saddlebag. No one touched it, not that night, not the next morning either. People in towns like this didn't talk much about moments like those, but they noticed. The regulars avoided parking too close to the empty spot. Leo didn't move the helmet, and when someone asked a week later why there was a perfectly good bike just sitting outside, all he said was, "It ain't yours." That was enough. The ride that left quietly didn't need a trail of dust to make a mark, just silence. And a decision not to ride away from a woman who hadn't asked for respect, but who had reminded everyone, loud men, quiet men, strangers and old ghosts alike, how it looked when someone earned it. The dust hung low across the parking lot like a memory that didn't quite want to leave. Particles drifted down in lazy swirls, catching the late light slanting through the trees lining the far edge of the property. No sound came from the road. No engine hum, no bark of rubber on gravel. Just the soft ticking of metal cooling off under the hood of a pickup she hadn't yet finished. Wren walked back to it. No words, no glance over her shoulder, no acknowledgement of the helmet left behind or the still settling stairs inside the bar. She moved the same way she always did, quiet, efficient, unhurried, like none of it had ever happened, like bones hadn't been twisted out of position, like a man hadn't dropped to his knees 6 feet from the door without her even raising her voice. The hood of the truck was still up. A belt was half looped through the pulley system, and a set of pliers rested on the frame near the radiator. The socket wrench was where she'd left it, clean except for the one smudge where someone else's hand had slapped it aside. She picked it up, inspected the teeth. Still good, still aligned. She knelt beside the front tire and leaned under the chassis again, rolling back onto the pad with the same economy of motion she used every time. Her boot stuck slightly on the oil-stained concrete, but she adjusted with one smooth shift of her heel. It was muscle memory, nothing more. Leo stepped onto the threshold but didn't speak. He held a towel over one shoulder and leaned quietly against the doorframe. His eyes scanned the lot, the bike still sitting near the fence, the faint trail of boot prints heading toward the highway. Then he looked at her. She didn't look up. Instead, her hand reached for the ratchet. A slight twist, a click, another twist. She tightened the hose clamp near the bottom of the engine housing where the coolant line had been leaking 2 days ago. Just another repair. Just another Tuesday or Wednesday. It didn't matter. Leo watched for a moment longer, then stepped back inside. No nod, no comment. The silence said what needed saying. Inside, things had returned to normal. The jukebox had shuffled back to an old Willie Nelson track. The regulars were already folding the moment into the space where bar stories go when they get too close to true. No one would mention broken wrists or the tattoo on her arm. No one would ask about the man who left without his bike. In a place like that, the stories that mattered weren't told loudly. They just settled into the walls like cigarette smoke. And spilled bourbon. Outside, Wren slid back out from under the truck, wiped her forearm across her cheek, and reached for a torque wrench. The sun had moved enough to cast long shadows across her tools, but she still worked by feel more than light. She didn't need to rush, her hands steady, scarred, precise moved, like they always did. Adjusting, tightening, aligning, as if they hadn't been ready to break a collarbone seconds before. As if adrenaline hadn't flushed through every vein in her body and then drained back into stillness. She didn't breathe any heavier. Her jaw didn't clench. No visible sign remained. A hawk passed overhead, shadow cutting briefly across the lot. Wren paused only long enough to squint up at the sky, wipe her hand on her jeans, and return to work. Nothing about her said fight. Nothing about her invited questions, but everything about her made sure there wouldn't be a second. The pump clicked once, then again, before shutting off with a final metallic thunk. The boy standing beside it blinked, as if the sound had startled him, even though his hand had been on the nozzle the whole time. He was maybe 16 skinny, elbow-jointed, with a mop of hair that hadn't decided what direction it wanted to grow. A sweatshirt too big for him hung from his frame, sleeves pushed halfway to the forearms, and a phone stuck out of his back. Pocket, screen cracked like a spiderweb. He hadn't looked at Wren before. Not really. Sure, he'd passed by the garage on his way to school, probably filled up his dad's truck at this very pump a dozen times over. Might have even bought a cold soda from the bar's back fridge during one of the slower summer afternoons. But he hadn't seen her not in the way people really see someone until now. Now he stood there, nozzle in hand, eyes caught on the shape crouched by the open hood a few yards away. She didn't look up. Wren had felt the stare the moment it started. Not with any urgency, just an old reflex, the kind that notices shifts in air before they matter. She kept her focus on the bolt she was tightening. 1 click, 2 clicks, then 3 to lock. Her hand moved with quiet rhythm, clean and steady. Her face stayed blank, her jaw relaxed, but she'd already logged his posture. Leaning just slightly forward, weight uneven between his feet. Not fear curiosity, he wasn't gawking, wasn't smirking like the men before him. This was something else. There's a look people get when something changes what they believe is possible, when a person they'd filed away as background noise, just another mechanic, just another quiet face behind a smudge of grease, suddenly rearranges the room. He wasn't trying to understand what had happened earlier. He didn't have the language for it yet, but he knew something had happened. Knew it enough to stand frozen in that moment longer than he should have. She caught the movement when he lowered the nozzle, placed it back into the holster. Slow, distracted, his eyes flicked to the bike near the fence. Still untouched, still upright, he looked back at her. Wren didn't meet his gaze. She adjusted the torque, stood slowly, and wiped the edge of her hand across her chin. No dramatics, no posture, just a mechanic doing the work in front of her. She could feel him building a story in his mind. Not the truth maybe, but close enough. She knew the look, had seen it on new recruits the first time a drill instructor moved faster. Then, logic allowed, he hesitated near the truck, keys in hand. His fingers hovered over the door handle, then dropped. He circled to the passenger side instead and popped it open, grabbing something from the glove box. When he emerged again, he walked deliberately toward her. She didn't move. He stopped. A few feet away, shifting from foot to foot, and held out a small envelope, handwritten on the front, "Thanks." Wren looked at it, then at him. Her eyes didn't ask questions, didn't challenge, she just waited. He started, then shrugged, cheeks reddening. "My mom says thank you for fixing the steering last week." She took the envelope with a short nod and tucked it into her back pocket without looking inside. The boy turned to leave, then paused. "And I saw what you did. With those guys." She raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He glanced down, then, "Back up, I didn't know people could move like that." Her mouth curled, not quite a smile, but something close. A breath of something unspoken passed between them. "People can," she said. "You just haven't been taught yet." He nodded, opened the truck door, and climbed in. By the time the engine rumbled to life, she'd already gone back to work. By nightfall, the retelling had already begun. 2 tables near the back of the bar leaned in close, voices dropping low, as if the walls might judge them for exaggeration. Someone said she'd flipped the first man over her shoulder like a sack of grain. Another claimed she used a pool cue to pin one of them to the floor. Never mind that the cues were all still unbroken and hanging neatly in their rack. Someone else swore she didn't even blink, that her hands stayed in her pockets the entire time, and that she moved like she wasn't touching the ground. They all got something wrong. It wasn't malice. It was just how stories behaved in places like that, stretched by AU, reshaped by pride or shame, twisted just enough to make the teller feel closer to the truth than they actually were. No one wanted to say they had sat still and watched, so instead, they'd seen more than they had. Or they'd heard it from someone who swore they'd seen everything, even if they'd only walked in after it was over. The trucker who'd been there from the start didn't say much. He nursed his coffee until it went cold, then ordered a second cup and didn't touch that one either. When someone asked him what really happened, he shrugged once and said, "She fixed the situation. Then she fixed a radiator." And that was all. Leo didn't chime in. He didn't need to. His silence had more weight than any of their half-told tales. He wiped the counter slower than usual, refilled glasses that weren't empty, and let the chatter pass over him like wind through trees. He'd seen it happen. All of it. And he knew the power in not claiming ownership of something that wasn't his. The photos on the wall behind the bar remained untouched. One of them, faded, grainy, showed a young woman in camouflage, her eyes narrowed against the sun. Nobody pointed to it that night, but more than one person looked longer than they had before. Outside, the lot had returned to its quiet form. The chrome on the remaining bike glinted beneath the bar's sign light. Number 1 touched it, and when a new customer parked too close to it later that week, they were quietly asked to move down a spot. No explanation given. Wren didn't speak about it. Not then, not later. She returned to the garage like the air hadn't been carved, with tension hours earlier, like the gravel hadn't echoed under booted feet or fists hadn't tensed. Her tools were cleaned and lined back on the wall before she locked up that night. No extra motions, nothing out of place, and still, the story took on a life of its own. Some said she was ex-CIA. Others whispered about secret training programs or government clearance. A few believed she'd once saved a senator's life in a foreign country. By the end of the week, someone suggested she had steel plates in her arms from an old explosion. They never mentioned the things that mattered. They didn't mention how she never raised her voice, how she didn't posture or threaten, how she let them talk themselves into a corner and gave them every chance to walk away. They didn't mention the way her hands moved, not flashy, not theatrical, just efficient. How the pain she dealt out didn't come from anger, but from precision. No one remembered her exact words, just that they were few and final. A man with a bandaged wrist came back 3 days later, said nothing, paid cash for gas, and left without making eye contact. That part didn't make it into the stories. The truth never does. The garage was quiet again. The kind of quiet that wasn't just soundless, but full thick with the residue of heat and dust and the hum of vengeance now at rest. Wren moved through the narrow back room like she always did after closing. Boots, scuffing faintly against concrete, hand brushing the light switch without needing to look. One bulb stayed on, casting a low golden cone over the far wall. That wall didn't face the customers. It wasn't meant for them. It was hers. To most, it looked like a collage of moments without explanation. Grainy snapshots creased at the edges, a few Polaroids with smudged fingerprints, others printed from old digital files barely holding color. Faces stared back, not smiling, not posed, just real. Most were men, some women. One group in soaked fatigues, standing hip-deep in mud, another crouched in a field with nothing but shadows behind them. Not all of them made it. Wren had stopped putting black X's over those photos years ago. It wasn't necessary, she remembered, who was gone. Tonight, she added one more. It was a small print taken from her glove box, folded twice, then kept under a spare rag for months. She smoothed it gently against her thigh before pinning it to the corner of the board, slightly off to the side, where only she would know it was new. It showed a mechanic's bay from another life. North Carolina, probably. A long workbench. 3 figures in frame, all laughing over something just out of view. She was one of them. Sleeves rolled up, smudge of oil across her temple. She pinned it with the same kind of motion she used to load a magazine or tighten a lug nut. No ceremony, just precision. Afterwards, she stepped back and took in the whole. Wall eyes moving across each face, each fragment. Some had tape curling at the corners. Others were clipped with mismatched binder clips or tacked over older prints. The arrangement wasn't neat. It wasn't meant to be. It was a map of everything that hadn't been spoken, everything folded into silence but not forgotten. A breeze slipped in from the cracked window above the utility sink. It rustled one of the older photos. She reached up, pressed it flat again. There were no medals on the wall, no certificates, no rank patches, just faces, moments. Proof? She reached for the switch, then paused, letting her gaze fall once more on the newest edition. A pause, not for sentiment, but for grounding. As if to remind herself that today had happened, that it belonged here now too. Not the fight, not the noise, but the way it ended. The choice she made to return to her work, to her stillness, that mattered more than anything loud ever could. Then she turned off the light. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound disappearing into the cooling dark. Outside, the moon was low and dim, the kind of pale wash that didn't cast shadows. Her boots crunched once on gravel before the sound faded. Somewhere, a late truck rolled past on Route 11. Somewhere, someone was already reshaping the story, but the wall didn't care. The wall didn't explain, it only remembered. The sun had dropped low enough that its light no longer poured into the bay windows but stretched long golden arms across the floor. Dust floated in its low, weightless, untethered. The kind of light that marked endings, but not the dramatic kind, just the quiet sort that signaled another day, folding inward. Wren lay on the creeper, beneath the frame of an old El Camino. Her right boot rested against the floor, just enough pressure to slide her along when she needed a better angle. A socket ratchet clicked softly with each turn, steady and unhurried. Her hands moved like they always did, measured, quiet, precise. Oil had stained the underside of her forearms, but she hadn't bothered to wipe it away. There wasn't any need. The stereo sat on a shelf near the back wall, old with a coat hanger antenna and one missing knob. It played something easy in low Johnny Cash tonight. The music drifted, settling somewhere between memory and backdrop. She didn't sing along, she never did, but her rhythm followed it. Outside, the gravel lot had gone mostly still. A few pickup trucks parked crooked along the edge. One left during the hour before sundown, another one had pulled in and never shut off its engine. But no one came through the garage door, not until now. The bar's door creaked. It was the same old hinge. Leo always said he'd oil it. He never did. It served a purpose. You always knew who was walking in nor trying to. Wren didn't pause. She kept turning the ratchet, adjusting the angle only slightly to reach the last bolt. The shadow moved across the lot slowly, not threatening, not hesitant either, just someone moving in. A space they weren't sure belonged to them yet. The bolt gave way with a soft clunk. She slid the creeper out from under the car, the familiar rhythm of wheels over concrete echoing gently through the garage. Still, she didn't look toward the door. She wiped her hands slowly on a gray rag draped over the stool nearby. Her back to the entrance, she knew the shape standing there would either speak or leave. That's how people worked in her world now. If they had something to say, they'd say it. If not, the silence handled the rest. A few seconds passed, then a voice low, uncertain spoke, didn't mean to interrupt. She didn't turn. You didn't. I just. The voice trailed off. Young male, not one of the bikers, not someone she knew. I saw what happened, he said finally, or what people said happened. Don't know what's true. She turned then, not fully just enough to glance over her shoulder. His stance gave it away. Shoulders not set for confrontation. Elbows tucked slightly in, one foot back. Defensive, but not scared. Not anymore, Wren tilted her head. He hesitated. I came to say you were right. People can move like that if they've been taught. She said nothing. He nodded, more to himself than to her. Just thought you should know someone noticed. She gave a quiet nod in return. Not thanks, not encouragement. Just acknowledgement. He turned to leave, footsteps crunching back across the gravel. Swallowed again by the hum of dusk, Wren turned back to the car. Another job, another set of parts that didn't talk, didn't guess, didn't need explanations. Just pieces, needing someone who knew how they fit. She reached for her tools. The music on the shelf rolled into a new track. Outside, the bar's sign flickered once, then held steady, and Wren worked on